I am going to be talking today about Lord Dunmore and the Ethiopian Regiment, but you're going to get a little bit more than just that because it's real. There's a lot of history that's involved with this. All of us are familiar with the famous words from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, today it's easy to say which side of the Revolutionary War you would have been on, but what side would you have picked then? It's not as easy as you might think. Today we're going to explore the early months of the American Revolution, and much of what I'll talk about comes primarily from Andrew Lawler's book, Lord Dunmore, A Perfect Frenzy, A Royal Governor, His Black Allies, and the Crisis That Spurred the American Revolution. The slides you'll see are Andrew Lawler, so I have heard him, and these are his slides. Excuse me. We'll also examine the role that black people, both free and enslaved, had on these events. So the first slide that's up here just says Norfolk, salty boomtown, because a lot of what happened in this time period in Virginia and affected North Carolina took place right here in this part of North Carolina. So Lord Dunmore was the royal governor of the colony of Virginia. Now, you can just see from looking at the slides, Norfolk was fairly considered a boomtown. It was the 8th largest city in North America, so still not huge. But it had shipyards, factories, distilleries. It was settled, well, I don't know if it was settled, but it was mostly inhabited by Scottish merchants who had left Scotland and come over, and they were the middle people, middle men, let's go ahead and say it, for the plantations and selling their goods to England and back and forth. So there was some resentment, I'll say, with them. There's also a lot of skilled enslaved labor there. People who owned slaves and they didn't need them on their plantations would send them to cities like Norfolk, and they would work, and they would get to keep some for themselves, but most of the money that they brought in went back to their owners. But they had a little more freedom in the city. So they were also free blacks in the area. So it was a magnet for those who were in bondage. The planters didn't really, they kind of resented the city. All right, let's see. Okay, it didn't change. Is it changing for you? Did it change for you? You said it was going to change when I did that, and it didn't. Okay, all right, thank you. All right, Lord Dunmore's Virginia. Lord Dunmore came to Virginia as the royal what? I'm not sure if that one can. Oh, now it went backwards. There we go. Is that better? Okay. Virginia at that time was the wealthiest and, of course, the oldest, if you want to say, settled, because we know North Carolina had the actual first settlement, and it was the most populous colony. Tobacco planters oversaw what Andrew Lawler calls forced labor camps. We're not familiar probably with that being called, but that's what he called, that's what they really were with slaves working those plantations. 4 out of 10 Virginians were enslaved. Land speculators at this time wanted to move into indigenous territory, which was on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. If you remember when the French and Indian War ended, basically Britain agreed to not let settlers go beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Well, tobacco wears out the land, they want to move, and so that was one of the things that was an issue. There was also a thing that went on where a slave went to England with his enslaver, and he sued for his freedom, and he ended up getting it. So, at that time there was a lot of underlying concern about slave uprisings because, the whites were outnumbered in many cases, and they were a little concerned about that. All right, let's see, what am I?
Just hit the arrow button.
It didn't go with the arrow button.
It didn't.
So
Right here.
I just hit it. It didn't go. Well, it did for you. It did for you. Okay, Williamsburg, as you know, was the capital of Virginia.
I work with her.
Yeah, you better come over here and sit. You better come over and sit. Be my technical person. Williamsburg was a fairly small town, though. It only had 2,000 people. Half the people in Williamsburg were free. Half were enslaved, and there were some free blacks also. It was, of course, the capital, and the College of William and Mary was there. Okay, it did that. All right, John Murray was the royal governor. He was the 4th Earl of Dunmore, and as it turns out, his father, they were Scottish. He had fought on the side of Scotland against the British just a few years earlier and lost at the Battle of Culloden. And his father was labeled a traitor. Well, John Murray was trying to make his way back into British good graces, and so he became a British soldier, and he was, through his wife's connections, he was named governor. And so he came here. His wife came with him. 6 out of the 7 children came. So they came in, they settled in the governor's mansion. He also bought plantations and slaves. So he fit right in with the planters, you know, that he had come in with. He was a good friend of George Washington's. All right, come on up to March 1775. Virginia patriots were meeting and decided to create a militia. They're getting concerned about what's going on with Britain, and more people are wanting to leave, but they're not completely sure. But they decide they need a militia because the British really didn't keep much of a force here, a standing army. Remember Patrick Henry's famous speech, "Give me liberty or give me death"? Okay, so the militia was narrowly approved. At this point, for most Virginians, the goal was not a new nation, but to roll back changes to the golden age before 1763. And that's the same as it was in North Carolina. They wanted to get it settled. They wanted to have their rights, but they weren't seeking a break. Okay, this is just a little slide about how Dunmore and Washington were actually good friends. They had a lot in common. And let me see if I can make this a little bit larger. Okay. So in March 1775, Patrick Henry called for the militia. We know in April the 19th, the Lexington and Concord battles, which really were the first battles of the war. Well, Lord Dunmore decides, he hears this, and he says, I better secure the gunpowder. So he seized the gunpowder there in Williamsburg. Well, of course, then the Patriots are saying, they're taking our guns, they're taking our gunpowder. How can we operate a militia without these supplies? So it's a big deal. There was an armed mob protest. They withdrew. And Lord Dunmore warns that if they don't back off, he will grant freedom to the slaves. Well, you know, that was like a battle cry for a lot of people. They're really upset. I mean, these people needed their slaves to run their business. You know, it would be like if somebody came in today and you were a farmer and they took your combine and your tractor and, you know, what you did business for. So it was a little bit scary. Then he said Henry's using this to kind of stir up the populace. All right, now see, I don't know why. Sometimes it changes and sometimes it doesn't.
I have no idea.
I don't know either.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was going on in, and we just talked about this briefly. That was the gunpowder incident that took place. Okay, well, by July 15th, Dunmore's getting concerned about being in Williamsburg and not having any army around him much. So he decides to go to Norfolk, where they can resupply him and he can be there. So he goes down to Norfolk. He goes by way of Yorktown. And Norfolk is pretty good size. Portsmouth was a suburb across the river. Wealthy, scarce, lots of shipyards, lots of skilled black workers. There were a lot of enslaved people who worked as pilots for the boats. So when the ships came in, they had to have a pilot that helped help them navigate the waters. So there were a lot of enslaved people in this area at the time. Of course, Dunmore's thinking, these are all people I could use, because maybe I don't have enough people on my side. All right, by October 1775, the first bloodshed took place at Hampton. And Joseph Harris, who was a well-known enslaved Hampton pilot, joins the British, and the Patriots demand his return. Well, the British attack Hampton, but they are beaten back, basically. Thomas Jefferson says, Lord Dunmore has commenced hostilities in Virginia and has raised our country into a perfect frenzy, where so the title comes from that. Okay, so the Patriot Dilemma, how to win support. Remember, the people that later became patriots were not on board at this time. Many of them considered themselves British citizens and didn't want to leave Britain. So basically, these patriots were trying to sway public opinion and get them on their side. And so one of the ways they did it was raise the specter of the enslaved people getting freedom, them escaping, uprising, and soon they were beginning to get more support from the rank and file people in the area. All right. Patriots' Achilles heel, and then basically they said the enslaved people were the Achilles heel. They were the danger, unpredictable. Okay, so here we come to November 15th, 1775, Battle of Kemp's, and it should have been skirmish at Kemp's Landing. I don't know why he put battle. But are you all familiar where the Great Bridge is in Chesapeake, Virginia? Well, the Great Bridge was the connection getting between Virginia and North Carolina. And so it was very critical to protect that bridge. And Dunmore knew that he was interested in that. Well, in November, they had this, it was later called a skirmish at Kemp's Landing. And they learned that the British won, and they learned that the black men would fight. In fact, one black man captured his owner. So that was pretty significant. And so at this point, after this win, Lord Dunmore issues this public proclamation telling the blacks, the enslaved blacks, that if they would join the British, he would grant their freedom. Well, who wouldn't be interested in that? So people, the black enslaved people started flocking to them. They brought their wives, they brought their children. He was training them, and he named them the Ethiopian Regiment. Now, the reason he named them the Ethiopian Regiment, even though Ethiopia is on the east coast and most of these people's ancestors came from the west coast of Africa, was because Ethiopia was a very well-known country and had some status. So by naming them the Ethiopian Regiment, it was giving them some status. And so they came, they learned, they fought, they were willing to fight. Originally, 200 to 300 black volunteers. They were paid to sign up, so they were given something, and they were to be, paid a salary, just like regular soldiers were. On their uniforms, it said "Liberty to Slaves." Well, you can imagine how incendiary that was to their owners. But anyway, it was considered the first black corps in the British Army. And of course, when Lord Dunmore did this, it was controversial even for the British because they didn't have any black soldiers in their army. So it really was a groundbreaking something. Okay, so that happened in November. Well, Dunmore's feeling pretty cocky here. He's issued this proclamation. He won at Kemp's Landing. He goes on to the Great Bridge, and they just, how the British used to march in line, across like this. And we learned in the French and Indian War to hide behind something and not necessarily stand up. And so they were waiting for him. And they square off at the crossing of the Great Bridge, And it was considered, even though there was a black in the previous one, it was considered the first fight between black and white American soldiers. Now, interestingly enough, there were blacks who fought on both sides. A man named Billy Flora fought on the side of the Patriots, and he was known for he stayed at the bridge and basically took off parts of the bridge so they couldn't cross, to give the Patriots more time to basically pick off the British. So he was considered a hero of that. There was also a Native American who was only 15 from the Nansemond Indian tribe who fought in that battle too. So there were Native Americans and blacks and whites who fought on both sides. So that's very interesting. The Patriots won the Battle of Great Bridge. And Lord Dunmore had not even bothered to come because he thought they had it in the bag. So he didn't even come. But they lost. The British and the Loyalists that lived in the area decided to abandon Norfolk for a makeshift flotilla in the harbor. They had hundreds of ships that they moved to. And they were living on these ships in the Norfolk harbor. And they all moved on. So it was like blacks, white, women, children, Native American, anybody who was with them moved on with them. And as this says, they stayed there until August of 1776. So that was a long time that they were living on those ships. Of course, they would come off and do little skirmishes, or they'd come off to get their supplies and stuff. But basically, they were confined to the ships. Dunmore was waiting for more people to come, but they weren't sending him anybody. So the Battle of Great Bridge took place in December 1775. On January 1st, Dunmore decides to send some people into Norfolk to burn the warehouses that are down by the water, because the snipers, the Patriot snipers, were using those to fire on the ships. They had their cannons, they had their guns, and so he thought, we'll burn down these warehouses and they can't get us. So that's what they did. Well, in the next day or so after that, Norfolk started burning. I mean, houses and houses and businesses started burning. Well, Dunmore got blamed because he had originally burned the warehouses. But it was actually the Patriots who burned Norfolk. Washington, who was already our general at that time, said that the burning will push Americans to accept the propriety of separation. I mean, you think about, this was the 8th largest city in the colonies, basically burned to the ground. And they're blaming the British. Well, it brought lots of people who were undecided over to the Patriot cause. The big lie. It wasn't until 1777 that they gathered information to do a report about what happened at the burning of Norfolk. Now, the war is still going on here. Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, the summer, July 4th. And so the war is 2 years in right now. And they did this report. And the report found that the Patriots most wantonly set fire to the greater part of the houses within the town. All 1,333 structures were destroyed, 96% by the Patriots. And this just says they found that after the burning in January, by February, they were ordered to destroy the rest of them, including the church. Now the church, St. Luke's, I think it's St. Luke's, the walls remained standing, but the inside and the roof caved in, and that has been reconstructed. Well, this report was hidden for 60 years. Nobody knew about it except the people who did it and top Patriot leaders, including Thomas Jefferson, who was one of those who kind of wanted Norfolk to be burned. He thought it was a good thing. John Marshall, later on was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, was one of the soldiers who participated in it. He was the only founding father that we know of that was there on the ground and participated in it. But of course it crippled Virginia's economy, and it was the war's largest single war crime. By May 15th, and that was a little bit later, this is going back to 1776, Virginia made its choice, and they met and decided to side with the Patriots. So they made it official May 15th, and that's before the Declaration of Independence was written and signed in July of that year. So it was a unanimous vote, and then Richard Henry Lee, who was from Virginia, introduces the Independence resolution in Congress and then broke a deadlock, because even in Congress they weren't completely sure that they were going to vote for independence. There were still people in the summer of 1776 who were still undecided. They still hoped that they could make their peace with the British. So Jefferson's declaration, referencing Dunmore, accused British of burning cities and instigating slave rebellions, and etc. So he used that as his argument. The Dunmore and his flotilla moved on over to Gwynn's Island, which is off of Yorktown, in May of that year. There was a huge smallpox epidemic, and they abandoned Norfolk for Gwynn's Island. A lot of the enslaved people who had joined his cause were killed by smallpox. You know, at that time there was no inoculation except direct inoculation, where you actually were given the live virus and you had to be in quarantine for 2 weeks. So Thomas Jefferson had all his family inoculated. You know, a lot of people were inoculated at that time, but it wasn't easy for the normal rank and file people to get inoculated. Enslaved people continued to come and join them. By mid-August, Dunmore and the Ethiopian soldiers retreat to New York. All the black soldiers that joined him were granted their freedom, and many joined the British Army. So what happened to the Ethiopian Regiment? When they got to New York, which the British controlled, the Ethiopian Regiment was disbanded because Dunmore no longer had that job. And many of them went into other units of the British Army and served throughout the war. There were many enslaved people who served for the Patriots. So there were many on both sides that served. But after the war, when the war was over, and the British gave up New York City, Dunmore took care of the people he had embraced, and he gave them the option of going to Canada, to Nova Scotia, which was still a British colony. And so many of them, thousands of them, left New York and went to Nova Scotia. And some of them later went to Sierra Leone, back in Africa. Some went to the West Indies, but of course most of them didn't want to go to the West Indies because that was a more dangerous place to be and a more deadly place to be. But many of them went on up there. There was one of their group who was called Titus Tye, and they called him Colonel Tye. Some think he did become a sergeant, but most of the people who commanded the units of the Ethiopian Regiment were white people who part of the British Army. So where are we? 2025 when he wrote this. We know it's 2026. Embracing competing freedoms. We want to celebrate Americans who fought on both sides because they were doing what they thought was right for them. And at that point, who was to know that little upstart colonists could beat the greatest country in the world? Of course, we wouldn't have done it without the help of the French and the Spanish. But, it wasn't so easy to say which side you would have been on. And if you were granted freedom to fight, that was worth it, to those people for sure. Historian Gerald Horn said Dunmore should be considered a founder rather than a villain. Washington and Dunmore were foes, but in the same cause. And of course, his point was Hampton Roads was a key crucible of the nation's birth and rebirth. Ripple effects. Washington was later forced to accept blacks in the Continental Army. You know, again, they were reluctant to do it because to arm these people who had been their enslaved workers was kind of dangerous. The British generals followed Dunmore's lead, and thousands were freed. But according to the Treaty of Paris, the British were to return all Patriot property, which included enslaved people. So, of course, they didn't do it because they had guaranteed them that they would have their freedom. Now, I will say the exception to that was at Yorktown, the last battle, and there were lots of blacks who fought in that battle on the side of the British. They sent them out ahead of time and abandoned them. And when they surrendered, the British could not protect them because they were there in Patriot custody, and so that they couldn't protect them. This was the beginning. Okay, and then just a little more about Dunmore. He goes on to do other things. But it was an important thing that happened in our history, and I was not familiar with it at all before the last 6 months. And so hopefully there's something that you've learned today and that you will take away from this.
I'm surprised that when he got the idea, and you said many came with their families, that the slave owners allowed them to go.
They didn't allow them to go, they just slipped away.
Well, they usually go after them immediately.
Well, but once they were in British custody, they couldn't get to them. You know, in other words,
That's still amazing.
yeah.
The way it
And
was.
what also was amazing is how the word got out. Because, you know, there were newspapers, but a lot of the enslaved people couldn't read. They hadn't been allowed to be able to read. How did they hear this stuff? How did they hear about it? You know, it's like it was talked about at the tables, and they were considered invisible. The word was passed on, and the word got out. And I mean, George Washington lost slaves to this. A lot of people, you know, they slipped away. I mean, who wouldn't want freedom?
That's right.
And I'm going back to the Declaration of Independence, where it says all men are created equal. Well, did they really mean that? No, they didn't. What? Not even
the right to vote for 1920.
Not even women. You know, it was just, yeah. So it was really, it was men who owned land
That's right. It was property.
at that time. Yeah. So what was said in the beginning, in other words, the word spoke to the enslaved people's hearts, and they wanted that too. Why not us, you know? And so they took what means they could to get it.
Did you give a number of, a guesstimation of how many were in that group?
The original, there were about 200 to 300, but eventually there were thousands. And there was a New England regiment that was very prominent, Rhode Island regiment that was very, so there were, and the DAR and the SAR are making a push now, many of you know about it, to locate these, what they call forgotten patriots, these people who served. Now obviously they have to have served on the Patriot side, not for the British, but there are a lot of them, and they're working to recognize them, Native Americans as well as black people. If you all watch Henry Louis Gates, you know, he's an SAR member. His daughters are DAR members. He actually was descended from a free black man at the time of the Revolutionary War that he didn't know until, you know, he did his genealogy. So there are lots of stories that need to be told and recognized. And there is a museum up in Nova Scotia that's dedicated to those black people who went up there and stayed and settled. And I've heard the director of the museum by Zoom talk. So it's very interesting. Many of them can trace their roots back to the people that lived in Tidewater, Virginia and North Carolina. Because people from North Carolina were coming up too. And you know, North Carolinians fought at the Battle of Great Bridge. They came up to help. A regiment of North Carolinians came up to help at the Battle of Great Bridge. So, anybody else? Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Brucie.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.